Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Friday, September 6th, 2024, and you are watching The Rundown, the second episode of my, weekly podcast in the sense that I'm trying to make this a weekly thing. It's a solo podcast for myself specifically, and it's somewhat experimental in that regard, as I've never really done a specifically solo podcast before. So, as of right now, this is a weekly thing, but if, things change or I got to make changes to my schedule or audience sizes changes, whatever it might be, then, perhaps it'll go by the wayside in the future and I have to come up with something different, but we'll see how it goes. Anyways, I am your host as always, Corrupt Rodin. Thank you all for checking out the podcast if it's your first time here. This podcast is all about those hot things that happen in the video game industry, such as news, for example. And to give you a rundown of this week's episode, we're going to be covering things like, obviously, Concord's shutdown failure, which happened today, of course. We're also going to be talking a little bit more about, well, not more, but just in general about Star Wars Outlaws and how the sales of the game, regardless of whether or not it's Star Wars, and perhaps the audience size is looking huge in regards to, viewership on Twitch and sales in general, still didn't necessarily meet expectations, according to analysts on the inside. We'll get into that, as well as, well, a little bit of a rant on my side about video games, fun in video games, and how a lot of people, specifically in the general access media space, seem to have an issue with video games being exactly that, video games. This was due to an article that I read a couple days ago, specifically talking about this subject, but I'll get into that. We'll be getting into that later on in the episode. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So first up, obviously Concord has officially shut down today as of September 6th, 2024. This was the day they said they were going to shut it down, so the servers are offline. For all those who still own copies of the game, unfortunately, they can't play it anymore unless they've refunded it, let's say on Steam, or took the game back to a store. However, there's a lot of people out there that are buying physical copies of the game now as a piece of gaming history, hoping that it will hold value to some extent in the future, which it may very well, if people have interest in owning a piece of history, so to speak. But that being said, the news of this whole thing happening hasn't necessarily gone down well for many people, specifically on the gaming journalism side or the access media side. And what's very bizarre about all of this is while a lot of people in the gaming side of things have specifically talked about the happenings as to why this game failed to begin with, it seems like the general gaming access media still doesn't quite understand how this whole thing went wrong. Even the business analysts on that side of things haven't quite nailed exactly what went wrong. And that's not to say that this whole thing failed for one thing specifically. It is an amalgamation of generally poor decisions on PlayStation's part to begin with. However, even with all of that, these people continue to ignore the elephant in the room. Let's take a look at some tweets here from some individuals in the industry talking about the game. We'll start with one Stella Chung from IGN, also known as Parallax Stella on X, formerly known as Twitter. Let's go over to that real quick. Hopefully this works as intended. She says, "My heart breaks for Firewalk Studios. The fact that it wasn't even given at least 6 months to properly sit through a season and adjust as a proper live service game is insane to me. It's very clear PlayStation didn't believe in this from the start and failed to support it." Now, this necessarily isn't to specifically attack her for this take. I think she just kind of misunderstands the particular issues surrounding the game to begin with. It's not that Sony didn't believe in this from the start. They very much did. So much so, they believed in it so much that in the upcoming Amazon series known as Secret Level, there is an entire episode dedicated specifically to Concord and its characters and its lore. To which they recently had to announce that they're going to continue on with that episode regardless of the game shutting down because, obviously at this point they're balls deep in it at this point. They can't pull out. So unfortunately, it is what it is. So it's going to stay. I guess you'll be able to see a piece of gaming history animated live on your screen at some point in the future from streaming services. But they believed in this product. They believed in it heavily. There were some rumors about the co-CEO Herman Hulst talking about how it was going to be the greatest place, multiplayer game of gaming history. And I had seen screenshots of that floating around, but I wasn't able to find any of the sources of it. I couldn't find any like news articles talking about it specifically or interviews from him in news articles talking about that specifically. So I'm kind of left hanging in the winds about whether or not he actually said that, if that was just made up news from, I guess, trolls on the internet. But if anybody happens to have information on that or can find articles in regards to that, feel free to let me know. But until then, those particular quotes about that, take those with grain, the whole damn salt mine, not just a grain of salt, the whole damn salt mine, because that I cannot verify that, and I've been looking all over for that, and I can't find it. From the beginning, though, when PlayStation announced, or rather revealed, Concord at the Sony State of Play, but 3 months ago, it was very clear that people did not care for it. When we take a look, let's go back here real quick. We're going to take a look at the general reception to that reveal trailer that happened, again, but 3 months ago. All right? So here we have, as you can see, on the YouTube side, you see down here where the mouse is, the like to dislike ratio on the reveal cinematic trailer for the game is insane. You have 6.3 thousand likes to 31,000 dislikes. I think the gamers have kind of spoken whether or not they give a shit about this game in general. So it was very clear this thing was not going over so well from the start. But then, to make matters worse, to add on to that, is that the general interest in the game simply wasn't there. And to that end, they mean that, general like pre-orders for the game were at an all-time low. Let's take a look at here. Let's take a look at a tweet from one Stuttering Craig on X, formerly known as Twitter, who talks about inside sources from major gaming retailers and pre-order copies, because the numbers are important here. Let's take a look at that. So this is the response to, I guess, his Assassin's Creed Shadows pre-order numbers thing. And he wanted to talk a little bit about Concord and how that went down, at least in terms of physical pre-order. Keep in mind, these are numbers for physical orders. And considering, times today where most people tend to buy their games digitally because of convenience, you can imagine the digital numbers were likely higher than that. Even more so considering that the closed beta of the game saw a pretty significant amount of players, more so than the actual official release did it anyways. So generally, the digital orders were definitely higher. But anyways, as you can see here, it says, my response, Concord. My insider told me in June, July, and August, Concord only had 231 pre-orders company-wide. 91 of them were canceled before the shutdown of the game. They sold 140 copies of Concord in over 900 stores. I want to reiterate, that is roughly one copy for every 6 stores. Now, some people might be thinking, well, who is this Stuttering Craig person, and why should we believe him as having a source about what's going on when it comes to game sales and pre-order numbers? This is Stuttering Craig formerly of Screw Attack, which if you're as old as I am, you remember Screw Attack being a pretty popular, I guess, machinima source of video games way back in the day, back in the early days of game trailers and the early GameSpot days and things like that. So I wouldn't put it past him to have some sources in the industry, considering his connections to the industry, especially in the early to mid 2000s. But you look at this and you can see for yourselves that the interest for the game just wasn't there. And a lot of websites and publications will tell you that it's those angry chuds out there, those angry bigots, those racists, those evil transphobes out there who made this game fail to begin with. But it didn't take much for that to happen when it was very clear that the interest for the game just wasn't there. Some of them will make the arguments that, the gameplay was actually pretty good. And that was a common, I guess, sentiment that I've heard from a lot of people that actually played the game, is that the gameplay was actually pretty decent. But the reality is that none of that matters if you can't get people to play the game in the first place. If you have nothing appealing about the game that draws people to it, your gameplay could be fucking amazing. It doesn't matter if no one's playing it. In the same case of a restaurant, you could have the top chefs, the best food in the entire country, but if you can't get people on the front door, it doesn't matter. Case in point, Concord. There was nothing appealing about this game. And then you top it all off with a perfect storm of things like the timing that it launched, which was right around the same time that Myth Wukong came out. Also for the fact that it cost $40 to buy the game just to play it, and it being a live service game on top of that. When it's competition, games like Overwatch and the upcoming Marvel Rivals, games that are free to play, means that they don't have any barriers to entry to get people in. The only thing that they lose when jumping into the game is not money, but simply time. If they don't like the game, they can just uninstall it. They won't feel bad about it. But with Concord, there is an investment. And while that investment is certainly lower than most games today, $40 is still asking a lot, especially in today's climate, for something that people don't know anything about and doesn't really have a hook saying this is why you should play it. So unfortunately, yes, it is rest in peace for Concord, but in most cases where you would almost feel bad for the team to have this happen to them, considering they spent 8 years on this project, the amount of poor decision making on the team side, on PlayStation side, at some point, you had to have seen this coming. And not surprising when many of your developers are out there attacking people on Twitter when they were calling this shit out. Don't be surprised when you earn little to no sympathy because of it. But anyways, as for me, I had no interest in Concord to begin with. I saw that reveal trailer, and regardless of the unappealing characters, the gameplay, which honestly looked to me like the Crucible from Destiny, which I was never the biggest fan of to begin with, I didn't care for it. It wasn't because of the appealing characters, although that honestly could have changed my mind if they actually had appealing looking character designs in it, which they did not. It still wasn't enough. And it's like I said before in the previous episode, it kind of speaks volumes, especially during the day when we did that commentary stream for that State of Play, when they revealed the game. Even then, when one of my viewers came in because she had missed part of the event, and she came in asking what game was being shown. And I gave her a general description. I said, oh, it's a hero shooter that kind of looks like Destiny 2 in terms of Crucible. And without her having even seen any of the gameplay or even knowing what it is, her first reaction was pass. Those are her words exactly. And the reason I bring that up is because that can be extrapolated to the average gamer as a whole. The ones that aren't necessarily connected to all this shit happening when it comes to gaming news in general. Just average Joe Schmo who just wants to play a video game. They hear something like that, and their first thought is, don't care what else is out there. That speaks volumes. Considering that the game had, from what I believe and what I've heard, is that it's had over a $150 to $2 million budget, the question begs to be asked, where the fuck did all that money go? Because it clearly didn't go in the game design. It didn't go into the character design. Where did that money go? You put out a reveal trailer for the game, or a reveal cinematic, which is 5 minutes long, showing very little gameplay, trying your best to establish your characters as this rip-off Guardians of the Galaxy, which did not hit with anyone in a time where people are kind of over Guardians of the Galaxy at this point. Like, what did you think was going to happen? Where did that money go? It is kind of wild what happened here, but it's not surprising. So, listen, if you want to grab a souvenir or a piece of gaming memorabilia, then perhaps you can grab a physical copy of the game and put it on a shelf somewhere and say, yeah, I was there when that happened. That game launched. I remember that. Or try to make some money off of its value, considering you're probably never going to see that again. And it was crazy to me how fast, this all happened. At the minute they announced that it was getting taken down, all instances or SKUs of the game just suddenly disappeared. I went to Steam to see if I could still find it. Couldn't find it. Totally delisted. I went to SteamDB, the database for Steam that keeps track of numbers of players and changes in terms of Steam pages and tags and things like that. All that stuff absolutely gone. I was trying to find information to compare player numbers between recent games and games that are coming out. Couldn't find it. Game is gone. Missing in action. That is how fast this shit happened. A lot of stores, it also caught them by surprise, where some of them were saying, yo, we've never seen this happen before, where the game just gets immediately canceled and now we got to get rid of all the stock that we have in the game. It is wild. September 6, 2024, the day that Concord shut down. And it wasn't a case of Sony not backing the game. They obviously did care about it. It was just a case of poor decision-making on all fronts. Speaking of games that aren't doing so hot, let's talk a little bit about Star Wars Outlaws. Because apparently, according to analysts on the Bloomberg side of things, that game's sales is also not meeting expectations, which in my opinion is kind of crazy considering it's a Star Wars property and fans alone would be enough, regardless of the quality of the game itself, to offset the costs. At least that's what I thought. That's what I thought originally. But apparently, according to analysts on the inside of things, the game is not living up to expectations. So much so that because of the middling sales, it has also caused a pretty significant drop in Ubisoft's stock, which is also a bad thing considering that Ubisoft has not really had a lot of bangers over the past year. And considering that Outlaws is one of 2 major releases this year, that sets a bad precedent for the future because all they have left now is Assassin's Creed Shadows, which I talked a little bit on last week's episode. That's also not doing so hot in terms of sales. So let me go back over here to Twitter. Once again, I'm referring back to the old stuttering Craig from Screw Attack days. Let's go take a look at that real quick. He says, I have an insider who works for high-traffic game stores in one of the most populated places in the U.S. They have 27 stores in that area, and there have been a total of 41 pre-orders for Star Wars Outlaws. 41. There is no hype for this game. Now, again, it's with a grain of salt because a lot of games these days, when it comes to purchases, a lot of them are digital because of the convenience. Even so on consoles, where it's easier to just buy the game on the storefront and have it downloaded on your console than it is to go out to a store and buy the game that way. But even then, considering that it is Star Wars, which is a massive property, regardless of the quality of recent events or recent outings by the company itself, whether it be LucasArts or Lucasfilm and Disney, like you would think that even then, those pre-orders would be pretty fucking high. But apparently not. And as Cigar says in the chat, investors seem very disappointed about Star Wars Outlaws sales numbers and let Ubisoft stock crash. Shares lost over 10% combined in the last 2 days, so the company just slipped to under 2 billion euros in market cap. Like, that says a lot when you consider that it's a fucking Star Wars game. So even that is not selling. And there was one by Grums, which, I mean, take what you will from Grums. I'm kind of in the middle when it comes to Grums in general, mostly because of like some of the like interpersonal content creator beef he gets in on Twitter, which I honestly do not care for in general. But when you look at the Twitch viewership for a lot of streams for that game, they were all in high numbers. However, this was quite sus, considering that news had come out around the time that Ubisoft was not only desperate to give people keys for the game to stream it and play it and make reviews for it, but that they were also potentially paying people to give the game positive press. So everything surrounding this game in terms of critical reception, commercial reception, all that stuff is already sus as it is, especially when you consider that a lot of the previews of the game before it came out kept showing the game in a not so great light. Anybody remember that fucking IGN preview where it was clearly showing bugs on display in terms of the game's stealth and everybody clowned on that? Well, guess what? That game is kind of full of very similar bugs. And yet somehow it still scored positively on many gaming media websites. High, in fact. So yeah, this sets a bad precedent for Ubisoft as a whole. Considering what's been going on, they have not really had any games that have knocked it out of the park. And considering this is one half of their major releases this year, which that other half is also potentially not doing so hot, who knows? Like I said before, Assassin's Creed Shadows, it's still, a month or two away? Perhaps maybe a couple weeks before the game comes out, those numbers just shoot through the freaking roof, right? And perhaps it all makes up for it. But when you consider the drama surrounding that game, about its characters, about the people that consulted on it so far, and when you consider the very negative reaction that the Japanese people had in regards to the reveal trailer and the characters in it themselves, and the person who helped work on the game or consulted on the game, you can see well, this is a perfect storm for this game to be a shit show as well. Will this be enough to tank Ubisoft? Who knows? But they have been hanging on by a thread for a long time now, and it's not looking good. That is wild to me, considering that Star Wars of all the properties can also. Well, I mean, then again, like the game could have sold well. Like when you look at the numbers themselves, you could probably say that the game sold well. But it's a matter of with gaming budgets these days shooting through the roof. You look at a game like on the higher end. Look at Spider-Man 2. That game was $350 million in terms of budget. That's a lot of money for a video game, man. But I imagine a lot of that came from the fact that it was a Marvel/Disney property. And they had to pay out the ass for that stuff. Which then in turn means in order to make up for that, you have to sell an absurd amount of copies to make up for that cost. And I can't imagine it's all that different for Ubisoft and Star Wars. I'm sure they paid a lot of money for this. So unless you're hitting, let's say, something relatively close to Black Myth Wukong sales, you're just not going to hit those numbers. It ain't going to happen. But when you consider what Black Myth Wukong is, in terms of a video game, and while some people say is a statement or perhaps even a warning to the industry, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, that is it's weird to see, honestly, to see the industry kind of floundering like this. But a lot of it is unfortunately self-inflicted wounds. Especially in Ubisoft's case, where they try to justify the price tag of a lot of their games by calling them quadruple A games. Remember Skull and Bones? A game which, I mean, if we're making comparisons to Concord, that game is still doing a hell of a lot better than Concord in terms of player counts. But even then, yeah, it's like we're jumping into this weird, like they're the first one to talk about quadruple A games. So I can't imagine they were thinking anything different when it comes to Star Wars Outlaws. But that just means that you spent a lot of money on this game and you got to sell a hell of a lot of copies to make up for that cost. And based on what the news comes from analysts on the inside saying that they're not too happy about it, you can see why this is the case. And in terms of like, you can kind of gauge popularity on consoles as well, because there is data surrounding that, in fact. From TrueTrophies.com, they indicated that Star Wars Outlaws, around the time of its release, was the 25th most popular game on PlayStation at that time, which continues to be well behind Black Myth Wukong, which still dominates the charts. And that can be gauged from physical sales and digital sales, because it doesn't matter whether how you bought the game, trophies are trophies. Like 25th place is not necessarily a bad thing, as most games would love to be able to reach that number. But when you consider the amount of money it takes to offset costs, development costs for a game and marketing and all that stuff, and licenses, 25th, still not good enough. And even worse considering it's a Star Wars property. You think it'd be higher than that. Doesn't have to be number one, but 25th? Anyways, on the topic of Black Myth Wukong, to get off some of this negative news, we'll talk a little bit about Black Myth Wukong. So obviously the game has sold incredibly well. And from what I've seen so far, at least the current number of sales as it sits currently, the last time we talked about it, the game had just hit 10 million sales in total across the globe. From what I'm seeing now, at least in recent articles, the game has finally crossed 18 million copies sold. And this is just 2 weeks after its release. We haven't even been a month since the game has come out, and it's already hit 18 million copies sold worldwide. That is insane. And people are projecting that those 18 million sales, the game is encroaching roughly $800 million from sales alone. That's $800 million. I've seen it range from 800 million to some people saying, what is it, 1 billion? But I don't know if that's ranging from what is it, yuan, the Chinese currency? But we'll see. But either way, that's a lot of money. A lot of games can only dream to achieve numbers like that. So the question becomes, as I've seen a lot of people ask, is Black Myth Wukong a warning or a threat to the industry? In my opinion, yes, it is, but it wasn't done with intent. Keep in mind, this was a game that was made with the Chinese demographic in mind primarily, yet somehow managed to gain worldwide appeal. When you look at that reveal trailer that came out way back in, let's say, I think it was like late 2019, early 2020, like that shocked the entire world. It wasn't just the Chinese marketplace. That shocked the world not only because of what that game is, but because of how beautiful it was at the time. It was one of those cases of showcasing next generation graphics technology, and people were blown away by that stuff. Then you top all that off to the fact that you had a lot of access to me. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. Well, it might be a lot considering, like, when you consider that all these places are in bed with each other, perhaps it is a lot. When you consider the fact that there was a huge amount of attempts to discredit the developers and the game itself over comments that some people said were made over a decade ago. But when you do the research on that IGN article, which was the sexism and misogyny from Game Science, they were pulling up tweets from these people way back in 2007. They were digging that far back to find some dirt on these people. So there were some malicious attempts to discredit this company and the game itself, which, if anybody knows what the Streisand effect is, all that did was bolster the game even more to people who wanted to play it and push back on the bullshit that was coming from these companies or these publications. So even with all of that and the attempts to stop it from selling well, it didn't stop the game's momentum. And while people will make the argument that the game sold, most of those sales are primarily in China, well, obviously it is. Like, it was a game made by Chinese people to appeal to the Chinese demographic. When you consider that China itself is home to 1.4 billion people, where most countries can barely even break 4 million in terms of population, you can see why it sold so well over there. But even then, just because that was the majority of the purchasing that happened in that regard, that does not discredit that the game sold really well all around the world in total. These are numbers that most developers can't even dream of achieving. And this is coming from a franchise or a Chinese folklore that very few people know about. Then there's the argument about whether or not the game is a case of woke versus anti-woke. But my question is, if the game isn't deliberately being anti-woke while also having none of what people would consider woke in it, like, does that not show that the game doesn't need any of that shit in it to sell well? When it's not putting in sexual identity or gender identity and politics and racial politics and racial identity, all this stuff, if none of that stuff is in the game, then the question that becomes, do any games need any of that shit for it to sell well? Is it possible for a game to just be a video game and then have that resonate with people? Maybe. But I'll get into that little topic in a bit because I do have a rant at the end here that I'm going to talk about in terms of I got to get some shit off my chest in terms of like the whole concept of fun in video games and video games just being themselves. But what's kind of wild to me when it comes to Black Myth Wukong, and this is the kicker to this whole thing, is that the game had a budget of $70 million over the course of 6 years of development, to which the return on that is $800 million. Considering that the game itself looks and even feels like a polished AAA title, with a team that's nowhere near the size of most AAA studios today, especially at Ubisoft, for example. That is kind of wild. Now, obviously, I know some folks are going to make jokes about the horrible, the quote unquote working conditions over in China and how poor the pay is when it comes to stuff like that. But even then, the fact that they were able to crank this out for a game that looks this good and has this much polish behind it, and is as in terms of scale as large as it is, for $70 million, when a game like Concord, for example, which is a multiplayer live service game, costs anywhere between $150 and $200 million to make, which looks nowhere near as good and isn't anywhere near as good. Yeah, I can kind of see how this is a threat or perhaps even a warning for the industry, because it literally just slapped everyone across the faces just by existing. Now, will that be enough to spark any real change in the industry that people would like to see? Like getting rid of all this shit because all the politics shit in it, because we don't need it, obviously. We'll see. But I can assure you this much. The layoffs, the shutdowns, the closures, this is only the beginning. It's not going to stop until something changes. So be prepared to hear more about that. But all right, let's move on into my final rant of the day. Well, for honestly, major rant, I guess I could say. So there was an article that came out from GameSpot this week talking about, they interviewed Shinji Mikami, I guess you could say the creator of the Resident Evil franchise. They had a chance to interview him at Gamescom this year, which happened, say, roughly a week or two ago. And a quote they took from that interview was that he thinks that modern games are taking themselves way too freaking seriously. And the truth is, at least in my opinion, let me show you guys the article here. In my opinion, he is very much correct about that. Now, when he made this statement, he was referring to the upcoming remaster that they're working on at Grasshopper Interactive, which is the remaster of Shadows of the Damned, which is a game that I also enjoyed way back in 2012 when I played it on stream way back then. That was a stream that happened a long time ago. But I enjoyed that game because it didn't take itself too seriously, because it embraced the fact that it was a video game and it wore it on its sleeves, which is the very thing he talks about in this interview, is the fact that Shadows of the Damned is very much a game that wears the fact that it's a video game on its sleeves. And is proud of that. But then it got me thinking, because I also watched another interview, which is it's not this one specifically. It was one in regards to these very two same people here in this thumbnail. They had a chance to sit down and play Sonic and Shadow Generations at Gamescom. They played a demo of that. And a common sentiment I kept hearing in this interview over and over again was that Sonic, the game, is a video game as video game. And while obviously this is the guy who heard the rant, I know who this guy is, by the way. This is Dan Reichert. While he enjoyed the fact that it was a video game as video game, you could tell the sentiment from the other guy was, yeah, I guess that's okay. But to add on to that, I also watched before the release of, well, I guess you can call it the release now, the release of Space Marine 2. I watched some people who had a chance to play the game. This was Access Media, had a chance to play the game before release. I watched this guy play it for an hour. And a common thing I kept hearing all throughout that video is, boy, this is a video game ass video game. God, this is a video game ass video game. And I kept hearing that. And at one point, he catches the fact that he keeps saying it all throughout the video and tries to hedge it by saying it's a video game ass video game. But, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like, if it wasn't a bad thing, then why did you feel the need to reiterate the fact that it's a video game as a video game about a good 3 to 4 times throughout your entire hour-long video? So my question then becomes, since when did video games being exactly that become a bad thing? This is a common sentiment that I hear all across Access Media in general and gaming publications, is when a game tries to be itself, acknowledges that it's a video game, and embraces that, even leans into it, somehow, for some reason, that is almost looked at as a detriment to what it is. While at the same time, that very same person from Access Media, and for those of you who know me and have been around my community long enough, you can probably figure out who it is I'm talking about. I'm not going to say the name here because I'm not trying to draw negativity to these people specifically. Because, truth be told, this isn't about them. This is about this sentiment that video games being video games is a bad thing. Anyways, back to my point. I then watched the video of them, this video released in the exact same day, roughly an hour apart from each other. There was another video from the new Astrobot that came out today. And throughout that entire video, you could hear them getting almost somewhat a little bit of emotional because of the content in the game, which harkens back to the legacy of PlayStation. We're talking the legacy from games like Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, Crash Bandicoot, the list goes on. And you could tell they were kind of like, oh God, you know, video games are never like this anymore. Wow, I kind of miss this stuff. You could hear that sentiment in their voices as they played the game. But when you look at Astrobot from a gameplay perspective, Astrobot is very much a video game in the line with those exact games that came out back in the early 2000s. You know, when games were not afraid to be video games. So you almost criticize a game for being a video game while at the same time praising another game for being exactly that. And what I've seen, at least in the general gaming public anyways, especially when that Astrobot trailer was revealed, is that when all the other games that they showed, like Concord, for example, wasn't quite hitting with people, the minute they showed off Astrobot, people were like, holy shit, what is this? I gotta get this. A game that by every definition is a video game as video game. There's been this weird concerted push. And again, this is a drum that I've been banging for years now, in regards to what the fuck is going on with video games being video games. As somebody who enjoys a video game being a video game. Over the past 20 or so odd years, there's been a real concerted push to move video games away from being video games, right? When you got games like Metal Gear Solid, The Last of Us, games that lean heavily on the cinematic aspect of them, almost movie quality like, I guess, nature to them. There was a real push for that. Why? Because it was popular. Everybody wanted to do that. Everybody wanted to be the next Metal Gear Solid. Everybody wanted to be the next Last of Us at the time. And because of that, people started pushing away from the video game aspect, no longer focusing on that to make sure that their games looked great, looked like a movie, felt like a movie, sounded like a movie, played like a movie. Well, played is kind of an oxymoron in this case, but you get the idea. And because of that, gameplay has kind of suffered. There hasn't been any real push to innovate in that regard because no one's focusing on that. And even more so, and it's not to say that this is the industry's fault as a whole, I also put some of the blame of this on us, the gamers, because the industry tends to move where the money is. And during that time, during the early days, games like a Crash Bandicoot or Jak and Daxter or what are the platforms, like a Sly Cooper, at some point, they started falling out of favor. People weren't buying them anymore. And I remember to this day, there always used to be real, like, especially in the old game trailers days, especially on the forums. I remember to this day, there would be constant console flame wars about people calling a console not good because of the quality of games it had on it. Especially during the early days of, let's say, PlayStation 3, for example. There's a lot of people that were harking on PlayStation saying, oh, this is the adult console. This is the game where real adults play video games. None of that kiddie shit on Nintendo. None of that shit on the Wii. That's all kid shit. We only play adult games here on the Xbox. So when all the sales are leaning towards games that are pushing gameplay aside for the fact of making games that are more cinematic, more movie-like, it's not really a surprise that a lot of that got lost in translation over the past 20 years. So yeah, we as gamers do bear some part of the blame of that. And you can't figure out why today, why you have so many games that feel incredibly bland and samey. You have a ton of open world AAA games that come out. And the whole open world component of these games these days, especially considering that Ubisoft took the world by storm with the first and second Assassin's Creed games, which established an open world foundation that many, I would even say most, AAA open world games still borrow from today. As a foundation, I can still count the amount of games I've played in the past year that still have you either climbing a tower to unlock part of the map or doing something similar to reveal part of the map. And the same way that those Assassin's Creed games did way back in the day. That shit still happens even now. And you can't figure out why all these games feel so bland, so boring, so samey, while all these open world games tend to run together and never feel that different. Even games like Elden Ring, a game that I loved, still borrowed some components of that. So is there a shift happening now for people that want to see games go back to embracing what they are, liking the fact that they're video games, enjoying the fact that they're video games, celebrating the fact that they're video games? I don't know. I would like to see that. It's a drum that I've been beating for almost a decade now. But this is a wait and see situation. Now I don't know what else to in regards to what to do in that field. So perhaps Astrobot, assuming it sells well, maybe that'll be a push in the right direction. Maybe a game like Myth Wukong will be a push in that same direction. Although, to be fair, one of the major criticisms I keep hearing about Myth Wukong is that it's not open world. Oh, God. Boy, I sure wish this game was open world. I sure as hell don't. I actually like the kind of game that it is. It's not open world, but it's big enough for you to get lost in. Not every game needs to be open world. That's kind of the problem today. A lot of the money that goes into these games that it kind of inflates the budgets is the fact that they keep trying to push for all that stuff in the games. Like, it takes a lot of time and resources to fill an open space that large. And somehow Myth Wukong managed to find, at least in my opinion, a pretty good balance of that, where it being linear while also being incredibly open at the same time. Where I've heard complaints of people getting lost in the game considering that it's not open world, or complaints that the game needs a map, which maybe it does, but I don't need it to be open world. I think that's stupid. We have plenty of those kinds of games already, and like I said, when you keep making open world games, you're going to fall into that checklist that I guess people call it the Ubisoft checklist these days, of having to go down and do specific events all throughout the game to make sure you do 100% in each area. Whereas Myth Wukong avoids that by giving you some side quests every now and then, depending on what NPCs you talk to. And you can choose to do that, you can choose to not do that. And I think that's great. And if they were to make a sequel, I would like to see them continue on in that regard while also improving on that idea in the future. It doesn't need to be open world. We got plenty of that shit already. But somehow, over the past 20 years, the idea of fun in video games, because at some point in time, we forgot the idea that video games are supposed to be fun. I wish I had the image right here. You know, that one image, that one meme of Neil Druckmann from Naughty Dog fame saying that we don't use the word fun in their office. This was in regards to them working on The Last of Us, obviously, because that game was obviously darker in tone, and they were trying to avoid the idea of it being a wacky video game, which there's a place for that. I'm not saying that those kinds of games shouldn't exist, but what I am saying is that we're getting a lot of games like that now because everybody wants to be that adult cinematic experience. Video games and developers, they've grown up now. They're not kids anymore. They don't enjoy that kind of thing. Since when? Since when? What, are you afraid the wife and kids are going to see you playing Crash Bandicoot? Uh-oh, better not let them see me playing Mario. That might be a bad thing. They might think I'm a child. It's like, it's no wonder that Nintendo still resonates with the crowd today, even the younger audiences, because it embraces the fact that its games are games. That is why Nintendo never really has any of these issues. And if anybody has been in my community, around my community long enough, you know that I play a wide variety of games. I can sit down, I can play a game like The Last of Us or Resident Evil, and then immediately jump into a Mario or a Sonic the Hedgehog or a Crash Bandicoot and have no problem with that. And not give a fuck who sees it. And I've always been that way. Oh no, people are going to think that I'm a bad gamer because I'm playing Kirby? That's a baby game. What? And you wonder why your games feel so bland. Why there's no variety. And the push for incredible realism on top of that, which is great in terms of graphic technology, but then you end up in the events you're seeing now where everybody's hiring all these A-list Hollywood celebrities to fill in these roles to become these models in games, and you know that shit's not cheap. You don't hire an A-list celebrity to put their likeness and voice in your game for a couple $1,000. Ain't no fucking way. Anyways, that's my general rant about what's going on with video games these days. And this article alone just kind of set me off on that because I kept seeing like this article was one part of it. But then watching people play some of the recent games that came out this week, almost complaining about them being video games, but then praising Astrobot for being exactly that. It was the weirdest contrast, the strangest form of hypocrisy I've ever seen. All happening within an hour of each other. And I thought that shit was wild. Like, oh, right, video games are supposed to be fun. I forgot about that. Holy shit. Did you know that video games can be fun? What Excalibur in the chat says to phrase C.S. Lewis, maturity is not caring about looking childish. Thank you. Like, I have never once cared about who saw me playing Kirby. Like, my youngest niece, who was like 4 at the time, caught me playing Kirby, and her first question was, "Can I play?" To which I said, yes, obviously. There was no embarrassment that she walked in and saw me playing a fucking Kirby game. I was actually happy that she was interested. Okay. Anyways, that's all I got for now. I am 6 minutes over the time I'm supposed to stop for this podcast. My voice is already leaving me, I can tell. But the major takeaways from a lot of this is, for this week's episode, that I would like people to take away at least, is that there is obviously I guess you could even say a cultural shift happening in video games, where a lot of the serious, dark tone games are kind of getting pushed by the wayside. Even more so when they suffer from things like politics in them, especially real world politics like we have today, whether it be gender identity, racial politics, the list goes on. People are kind of tired of that shit. And I can't blame them. As a as a black person, I am also tired of racial politics in all the games I played this year and last. One of the major things that I really disliked about Alan Wake 2, which is a game I waited years for, considering I loved the first Alan Wake, and I could not have rolled my eyes harder during the moment when Saga Anderson says, "Oh, it's another white man. I'm so tired of another white man telling me what to do." I couldn't have rolled my eyes harder during that moment. I'm so tired of that shit. That wasn't the sole reason why I felt so bad about, felt so not so great about that game in general, but it was definitely a component. And I wish I had more time to get into that right now, but unfortunately, with me being at the end of the podcast, I cannot. But there's a whole host of issues about why I did not care for Alan Wake 2. As somebody who loved the first game, I was very disappointed with this. And then you hear the news about them. Oh, we're gonna make a TV series with Alan Wake in control. And I'm like, for fuck's sake. This whole idea of pushing things to be movies or turning movies into games, games into movies. This is the shit I can't stand. Because they're trying to bridge that gap. And I think it's unnecessary because now you're killing what makes video games great to begin with to turn them into movies. That's what started all this shit. Again, I'm not saying these games can't or shouldn't exist. I'm saying that the push, because these games became popular during a certain time frame, has kind of ruined the aspect of video games that make them special to begin with. Speak with your wallets. And we definitely did back then. And because we did back then, it pushed a lot of those video game components, or the games that were video games and proud to be so, out. So you don't get those wild, ridiculous games like a Shadows of the Dam with with what people consider childish humor. You're not going to get that anymore. Not just because, the social climate has changed and people don't like that kind of, people aren't akin to those kinds of jokes anymore. But because nobody was buying them. And again, part of this is on us, the gamers, for this. Not all of it, but we bear some part of the blame. So going into the future, you support the games that you want to see more of. Don't just sit on the sidelines and think that somebody's going to do it for you. And don't be afraid to play a video game that is in fact a video game and is proud of that. Because you will find more often than not that you will have yourselves spending more time on a game where gameplay is at the utmost importance, as opposed to everything else, where you put the controller down and watch it all happen in front of you. I've gone back to far more games recently, slightly retro, relatively recently, that have put gameplay at the forefront. And I can tell you this much. When I pull up that controller and I start playing, I will spend far more time with that game than I will with a game that has a shit ton of cutscenes from the jump. Anyways, that's all I got for now, folks. Thank you all for watching/listening. I'll probably try to make some clips out of this stuff because I kind of went on rants for a while there, but we'll see how that goes. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully, if anything, there's something that you took from this episode. I hope you do. The archive of this will obviously be up on YouTube for those that missed the early portions of it as well. And like I always say, if you guys enjoyed this, be sure to like the video. And also, if you have thoughts that you want to add as well, feel free to leave them in the comments. Like I do read comments. I do read comments, and I don't necessarily. I guess I don't. From what I haven't. Filtered any comments except for those that are like porn bots. I usually filter those out, but yeah, I do read all comments. So that's it for now, guys. I will see you all next week Friday. Like I said, I might try to push for some quick hit episodes like during the week if I can, if time allows. I'll try to aim for that, but we'll see how that goes. If you guys enjoyed this, I'll try to push for that stuff too, and you want to see more, just let me know. I'm open to feedback, and I do appreciate it regardless. But okay, I'm out of here, guys. Thank you all for watching. Meantime, you all have a wonderful day or night, depending where you are in the world. You all stay classy, stay sharp, don't do anything that I wouldn't do, and I'll catch you guys next week. I'm out this bitch. Deuces. Fade to black.